So we're very lucky today to have four distinguished guests who are going to talk to us about their one thing for nature. So as part of the conference schedule, Yvonne, I think, ran the hashtag One Thing for Nature, and I got a fantastic response on social media. So what we've asked the participants here today is to make a pitch for their one thing for nature. And I'm sure many of the people here are already familiar to you, but I'll give them an intro all the same. We have James Moran, who is lecturer in ecology from GMIT and is a specialist in high nature value farming. We have Lamhna at the far end there, who is a distinguished broadcaster and scientist. We have John Gibbons, who is a climate environmental journalist and with Antashka as well, John, yes, occasionally. And we have Yvonne Buckley, who is Professor of Zoology from Trinity College, Dublin, and who is chair of the Natural Capital, the Biodiversity Forum. And you're involved with the Natural Capital as well, no? Ish, okay. So we know where we're all coming from, ish. So the format of this debate is going to be, I'm going to give each of these speakers 5 minutes to make their pitch. And then we'll have a little to and fro after that. So what I want you all to do before we get going is to go on to the Slido platform, which I hope you're now all au fait with. And what I want you to do is, while the debaters are speaking, I want you to put in your one thing for nature into Slido, and what will happen is we'll get a word cloud here at the back, and we'll see how that pans out with what the speakers are going to say. So please think of your one thing for nature, and the more one particular word or one idea is used, the bigger it'll appear on the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Eanna to, and Eanna, maybe just sit where you are, and I'm going to keep an eye on the time, and you have a microphone there beside you, and...
can I not stand over there?
Well, if you must, right. But I'm pulling the plug after 5 minutes.
I won't go over, but I couldn't possibly speak sitting down. Afternoon, everybody. Don't count that. Okay. Right. Rachel Carson nailed it in her book Silent Spring, which was published in 1962. Now, she pointed out that soon spring would be bereft of birdsong and dawn choruses because the birds were being poisoned by organochloride biocides. These were being applied as weed killers and insecticides, but because they didn't break down, they moved up through the food chain, becoming concentrated in very high levels in birds and top predators. Her book was so influential that it resulted in a complete ban on the insecticide DDT and in the setting up of the United States EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. There's women for you. Biocides no longer contain chlorine, which was the reason why those 1960s poisons never broke down, but a whole new suite of poisons based on phosphates, organophosphates, came into being. These did break down and were not concentrated at the higher levels of the food chain, and our Irish population of peregrine falcons, which were down to 60 pairs at that stage, they recovered, as did another raptor, buzzards, which spread back into Ireland from Scotland because they got rid of strychnine, and they occur over farmland in every county in Ireland now. But the problem hasn't gone away, you know. A main cause of decreasing biodiversity is the very simple fact that we have fewer wildlife than ever now because we are killing them in great numbers still with herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, malocides, rodenticides, fipronil, neonicotinoids, biocides of all sorts. A recent report published in the Journal of Biological Conservation says that 40% of insects worldwide are categorized as declining, with a third actually described as endangered. This is because biocide use, among other reasons, is causing this. The rate of extinction of insects at 2.5% per year is actually 8 times faster than that of vertebrates. You can do the vanishing sums yourself. Mosquitoes may no longer be a problem in 50 years' time, or wasps, or midges, or butterflies, or bees, or people. This is a highly agricultural country. Our main crop is grass. 55% of Ireland is covered with it to feed our 6.7 million cattle and our 5.5 million sheep. And this is, of course, highly productive single-species grassland. We're not talking here about pasture fields full of wildflowers. Copious amounts of nitrogen and weed killers ensure this. The amount of life-killing poisons, biocides, that are used in the Irish environment increases year on year. 2,913 tonnes in 2013, 3,015 tonnes in 2014, 3,121 tonnes in 2015, 3,135 tonnes in 2016, and more last year. These kill target and non-target species alike. They are exceedingly effective, and as a result, there are very few insects for bats, swallows, swifts, frogs, etc. to feed on. Total insect numbers are way down. When was the last time you had to wipe dead insects off your windscreen? A job for which it was worthwhile selling special sprays in the 1970s. And they're not all organophosphates that break down after killing huge quantities of their intended targets either. Rat poisons, rodenticides, are now second-generation anticoagulant poisons, the rats and mice having got immune to the first-generation ones, such as warfarin. 85% of our barn owls are known to have rodenticides in them, according to a recent Birdwatch Ireland report, not to speak of buzzards, red kites, kestrels, and even bird-eating species like sparrowhawks and peregrines. Their food chain is contaminated by snails and slugs, feeding on rodenticides left out as permanent bait. Neonicotinoids are absorbed by the whole plant, so it's not just the leaf-sucking aphids that cop it, but also the pollinators feeding on the nectar, the bees collecting the pollen, the ladybirds feeding on the aphids, all of those. Fipronil sterilises the soil, killing all insect life there. Now, it has been banned in the EU since 2017. Hasn't been banned elsewhere, so I wonder where it'll be at the end of March. How near will it be to us then? We can conserve our habitats. We can fight climate change. We can have pollinator plants and wildflower meadows. But as long as we pump 3,500 tonnes of chemical biocides into our environment every year with the express aim of killing wildlife, how do we think we are going to increase biodiversity? At the rate we're going, it won't only be spring that will be silent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eanna, for that passionate promotion for removing biocides. So I'm going to ask John next.
Thank you, Padraic, and thank you for the invitation to take part in the conference. I suppose I'm on a slightly sticky wicket in that I've decided to take on the least popular cause of all, I think, in this, and that is the argument that the one thing we need to do is to deal with climate change. My argument would be, I guess, that climate change is the defining struggle of the 21st century. Win it, and a viable future remains at least a possibility. Lose it, and everything is lost. Everything you care about, whether it's biodiversity, human rights, or the prospect of a safe future for your kids or mine, it's all gone if we fail to hold the line on climate change. It's as simple and as blunt as that. I'm well aware that the phrase tackling climate change sounds like one of those vague terms like world peace that everybody is in favour of, but nobody seems to have any idea how to actually achieve. And in fact, on social media this morning, I was being advised to talk about something else, pretty much anything else, something we can do something about, as Eanna has so passionately described there. You know, let's deal with the biodiversity loss and ecosystem depletion, which I'm 100% on board about, of course. But I'm going to stick to my guns, and I hope you'll see why. And I guess for me and for many people, dealing with climate change is often seen as being as elusive as trying to get to the bottom of the fourth secret of Fatima. But it shouldn't be. It really shouldn't be. What we need to do is, in fact, painfully simple, and even a child can understand it, and I'll come back to that point shortly. We need, globally, immediate, radical decarbonisation of every sector of our societies and our economies, including our food production systems, all of them. Sector by sector, when you break it down, we can do this. But as we've seen time and again, especially here in Ireland, the three biggest headwinds that we face are political inertia, media indifference, and the hidden power of special interest lobbyists. I think there's this idea that if we can tackle biodiversity loss, which is a good thing, we can reverse much of the damage and restore many areas to pristine condition. And of course, there's a lot of truth in that statement. However, there are limits to what we can do. And let me explain. And I'm going to explain through the filter of the Loquilo rainforest in Puerto Rico. It has benefited over the years from extensive protection, and it appeared, at least to the untrained eye, to be pretty much in pristine condition. That was until a study was published last October by the US National Academy of Sciences. What they found was 98% collapse in the number of arthropods in the forests compared to the 1970s. So in 40 years, practically all insect and invertebrate life in this otherwise pristine forest has disappeared. So what happened? We can't even blame the pesticides and the fungicides and the herbicides in this particular case. So what happened? The rainforest temperature in this period has increased by 2 degrees centigrade as a result of global warming. This seemingly small temperature shift has disrupted the forest food web. And as you know, arthropods are the linchpin of these webs, so their demise is bad news indeed for the rainforests. And as you might expect, the animals that feed on these insects, whether it's lizards, frogs, birds, etc., they're all in deep crisis. I appreciate that for many people working on the front line of nature conservation, people battling with the tangible causes and consequences of biodiversity collapse, whether it's agricultural intensification, peatland destruction, overfishing, hunting, pollution, it might seem a bit of an abstraction for people like me to be fretting about what the mean global average surface temperature will be like in 10 or 20 years' time. I really do understand how frustrating that is for some people. I also understand the view in some quarters that environmental concern can be seen as a zero-sum game. So, therefore, if there's too much focus on climate change, what we're doing is we're eating into a very slender slice of the available political media pie. Therefore, other worthy subjects are getting crowded out. But, as the fate of the Loquilo rainforest shows so clearly, nature conservation without climate stabilisation simply won't work. It can't work. And every hard-won gain that conservationists make will, sooner or later, and I would argue probably sooner, be wiped out by climate breakdown. I'm here today to suggest that rather than arguing over whether nature conservation or climate activism deserves a slightly bigger slice of the pie, we really need instead to be taking over the damn bakery. After all, in a rational world, imagine for a moment that we lived in a rational world. How might it be different? First of all, I would suggest that the ecological and climate crisis would be on every news bulletin and on every newspaper, front page, every day, and not just when there's a conference. It would be the central preoccupation of our politics, our civil service, and our private sector. And of course, you're saying, well, that can't happen. I mean, when did that ever happen? Well, look at Brexit. 3 years ago, it was a non-issue. Now, this entirely man-made fiasco, we're being consumed with it almost 24 hours a day through the news cycle. And our politics is being consumed by it. And yet, what we are describing today, what's happening right now to the natural world, is 1,000 Brexits or more. And I don't say this in order to be fatalistic. Quite the opposite. This is a call to action. I think we need to be a lot less polite, a lot less patient. We need to take to the streets to start putting our politicians, our public service, and our media under pressure to act now in line with the science. We need to take the hard decisions on climate action like our lives depend on it, because our lives depend on it. I'm going to finish up. I mentioned earlier how this is all really simple. This is child's play to understand these issues. So I'm going to finish up by mentioning a remarkable 16-year-old Swedish climate activist who I'm sure many of you have heard of, called Greta Thunberg. This young woman has descended like a thunderbolt, and she's inspired the global school strike movement. So while she's talking about climate change, her words could equally apply to the global biodiversity crisis. And I'm going to give you what Greta said, just to finish. She said, adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, John. And anyone who is in this room for the session before this would have heard some very inspiring young Irish people who are making very similar messages. So next up, I'm going to ask James Moran to make his pitch.
Okay, so my one big idea for nature will be, well, I'm going to cheat a bit because I'm Mayo man. If we're going to win in All Ireland, if any follow GA, I'm going to have to cheat to win it. But so my big idea is that I'm going to solve all the other speakers' problems with one big idea. And that one big idea is a new integrated land use policy where we value people, nature and food together. This will solve the biocide issues, it will solve the climate change issues, it will solve any issues that Yvonne raises, and it will also solve any issues that's raised by the audience. And the big thing here is that we cannot just we haven't got just one thing for nature. We have to have a multitude of things for nature. In the last session I was in terms of the interactions between biodiversity and agriculture in terms of agriculture policy, when we put up the questions on the Slido at the end, and the suggestions, we were just streaming through suggestions. So there's lots of small things we have to do to combat the large major issues that we have. Just speaking of agriculture a bit, in terms of an integrated land use policy for Ireland, this really has to focus on our agriculture and forestry sectors, dealing with the societal challenges of climate, biodiversity, water quality, food security in an integrated manner. Agriculture areas control 64% of the land base. Forestry control another 9% of the land base, given a total of 75% of the land base is controlled by either agriculture and forestry. How we manage that land determines what we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the environment in which we live. So it's not a question that when our CAP strategic plan comes up for debate over the next 9 months and when the decisions are made. Now we know that the decisions that have been made in previous policy decisions are not working. Under any circumstances, from a societal point of view, they're not working in meeting societal challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, water quality. They're not working from an economic point of view in terms of farm incomes. Farm incomes are going through the floor on a constant basis, okay? So why are we not just blowing this policy out of the water? So from the point of view of this policy, we cannot blow it out of the water because it's so complex. So we have to start somewhere, okay? So all I would like to do is throw a bomb in there in the morning, We have to start from where we are at the moment. So we know what has gone wrong. We know what the issues are. We have many examples from this conference today, and we'll see more tomorrow, of things that will work both in the Burn, the Aran Islands and upland areas, in dairy environments. So we know what can be done. We know what needs to be done in terms to reduce our emissions. We simply have to cut our national herd and actually match the actual production of our land to the capacity that it's able to produce. Work within the limits of the environment. So an awful lot of this, I think, it's relatively easy to explain to a 12-year-old, okay? But the situation has been, as we get into adulthood, we complicate things too much. We have competing interests, we have lobby groups, we have a very complex society in Western Europe. So to bring this all back, I've worked in the interface between agriculture and biodiversity for over 20 years, and it's abundantly clear to me that essentially we are dependent on functioning farming systems working within the capacity of our agro-ecosystems. So that's not rocket science. We need agriculture. It's not agriculture versus the environment. We need them both together. And it is abundantly clear, particularly in the main areas that I work with, high nature value farmland areas, that you cannot devolve nature from farming. They're inextricably linked with each other. These are areas that are farmed semi-natural vegetation that support species and habitats of conservation concern. We abandon agriculture, we lose these species. We don't have these species, we don't have the agricultural system. And one thing that I think we could do is we have a third, roughly speaking, we have a very diverse agricultural system in Ireland. It's not uniform. It's not all awash with herbicides and pesticides. It's not all abandoned at the top of mountains. Our forestry is not all monoculture Sitka spruce, even though a vast majority of it is. So we have a diverse land base. So what we do is, where we have a third of our area that's high nature value farmland, we drive on with extensive livestock production in that, but we concentrate and reward farmers for biodiversity production, for mitigating against climate change, for high status water quality. In our areas that are about a third of our area, about 20% maybe being more realistic, that has the capacity to produce, to support high stocking rates and high intensity of arable production, that can be our centre of food production. But supported by the other areas. It's not one versus other, but them areas also must minimise their impact on the environment. So what I'm proposing is that we support our third that is high nature value farmland, we support our intensive farmers, but even within our intensive farming situation, on average, 10% of that land base is made up of high nature value features, which are our wetlands, our woodlands, or our hedgerows. So we manage them, that green infrastructure within our intensive landscape, and we manage a green infrastructure in others. Then we have this huge land area in the middle, the areas that I see from basically the midlands of the country that are coming out of industrial peat production, the areas that have been reclaimed peatlands into agriculture in this area, our drumlin belts that are not managed optimally at the moment for either biodiversity or food production. We have decisions to make on them areas. Some areas within that might be very important in terms of the forest sector. Some areas might be very important in terms of food production, but they all can deliver on the environment as well. And often I see when I'm talking to agriculture, it's this production good, environment bad. Environment good, production bad. There's one figure that I read this morning that puts all this in context. From a production agriculture point of view, your holy grail is to support as many cows per hectare at as low a cost to maximise your profit. So you see yourself as a production farmer if you can produce large amounts of meat and milk, and you can maybe stock your farm to 2.5 to 3 cows per hectare. Now, one thing I would like to say, that production is actually supported by the soil biodiversity. Within the soil rooting mass alone, we have 15 tonnes of live weight. Okay, 15 tonnes of live weight in the rooting base of the actual soil. So that is equivalent to 20 cows. Okay, so our livestock production is not standing on the shoulders of giants, it's standing on the shoulders of soil microbes, soil invertebrates, and if we divorce that from our production systems, then we have lost everything. We have lost our food production. We have lost the climate debate. We have lost biodiversity, and we're the next ones that are going to go extinct. So my big one, an integrated land use policy where we equally value the land across the country, valuing people, nature and food across the whole country.
Thank you very much for that, James. I'm just looking at glancing up at our word cloud here, and I see agriculture and I see farming a little bit. I don't see much climate, and I don't see. Do I see pesticides? Not so much so far. So anyway, we'll get a chance to vote on all the speakers' ideas later on. So finally, we're going to say goodbye to our word cloud, and we're going to say hello to something else. And Yvonne Buckley is going to give the final pitch.
So there's nothing that sends an academic into a tailspin faster than asking them to give one solution or one answer. So when I was asked to take part in this debate, my first reaction was blind panic. I've been involved in environmental decision-making, making models to help people to decide what to do about environmental actions. And that requires that we understand what the objectives are. So having a really clear problem definition is important. And then you can propose solutions, and then you can look at the costs and benefits of those solutions and come up with one or a few answers. Now, I didn't have the time to do all that, unfortunately, so I took a different route. I decided to crowdsource my answer. I did this in a few different ways. One was by running the One Thing for Nature hashtag Twitter campaign. So people tweeted with the hashtag One Thing for Nature. And I'm also a data scientist, love data. So I got all the tweets, and on Sunday I spent most of the day analysing the tweets. So there's hundreds and hundreds of tweets that came in, and produced this figure. So you can see that these are the most popular words that came up in those tweets. Things like collapse and stop. So there's some high level of frustration out there with the status of biodiversity in Ireland, with the 90% of our habitats and species being in poor condition. Stop doing things. Stop peat extractions. Stop cypress spruce forestry. Stop. These were all of the kinds of stop messages that were coming through. Then there was a whole load of tweets and words around holding people to account in terms of auditing, in terms of trying to work out whether the gains that we're getting from environmental actions or conservation actions are actually doing what they're meant to be doing. So that's the words account and hold. There was a lot of words around national, around Ireland, around this being a whole of country issue and cross-sectoral issue. And there was a lot of words around food and agriculture and food production, which are actually, a lot of those tweets were quite positive. It was around trying to, exactly as James said, trying to connect people and food and nature, and people understanding that food is essential to our lives, and that we should maybe try and produce it in a more nature-friendly way. And then I think this is fantastic, and this has happened over the last year or a little bit longer in Ireland, where the importance of insects, bees and pollinators has massively come to the fore. If you had done this kind of word cloud last year or the year before or a couple of years ago, you might not have got those insect conservation messages coming through so strongly, and this understanding that insects are the little engineers that run around in our ecosystems and that provide us, or fly around in our ecosystems and provide us with so many undervalued but essential services. And the All Ireland Pollinator Plan came up in many of these tweets. It's really gotten a lot of ground recently, and that's fantastic work. I didn't just consult Twitter. I took my One Thing for Nature hashtag to primary school kids. Orla very kindly allowed me to ask 40 school children at a tree planting workshop for Easy Treesy what their one thing for nature was. And they were just radical. They were great. They told me to go vegan. They told me to put my phone away, go outside more, take the bus, walk, don't use plastic, stop using single-use plastics, stop polluting, stop driving. They were just totally into it. They understood that one thing for nature didn't just mean putting bird food in a bird feeder, or providing homes for bees, or protecting tigers, or all of those great activities, but it's about how we live our lives, how we eat, how we travel, all of those things that feed into climate change and feed into bigger environmental issues such as that are really important for biodiversity as well. So that was fantastic to see the level of education and understanding in 9 and 10-year-olds of how all of these issues are connected. So that was brilliant. I then took my One Thing for Nature hashtag to Trinity College, where I work, to about 15 or so PhD students, postdocs and academics in our weekly Tuesday lunchtime nerd club, where we discuss issues like this. And I was expecting them to come up with all kinds of crazy left field ideas, and they were so pragmatic. We need to enforce the legislation we have now. We need to govern, really govern what we're doing with biodiversity properly, show leadership at all levels. We need to implement the National Biodiversity Action Plan. We need to engage people with the issue. These weren't ivory tower concepts. These were just pure pragmatism, because they see the issues and they see that the actions are that simple and all-encompassing, but simple and very pragmatic. So at all levels at which I kind of elicited ideas, One Thing for Nature, solutions, they weren't sci-fi solutions. They're solutions that we know exist, that we can implement now if we have the will and the funding, absolutely critical to fund these actions, and the engagement from society and the contributions, and people banging on TDs and MEPs' doors and lobbying businesses and voting with their wallets. The engagement is a huge, huge part of this. So ultimately, we can all do one thing. There are 119 actions in the Biodiversity Action Plan. Our actions are not confined to that plan, but if we could implement the Biodiversity Action Plan, and I believe we can with the will and the funding and the enthusiasm and engagement of people in this room and more broadly, we really will be able to do an awful lot for nature. So I'm going to finish there, and my one thing for nature is implement the plan we have now, and we'll get a long way.
So what I'm going to do is ask maybe if we can get our original word cloud back, and if you've had any thoughts since hearing the speakers, you can add more words to it. I mean, feel free to have lots of one things for nature, if you know what I mean. So what I'm going to do is I had a look at the hashtag on Twitter, and I had a look at what other people were thinking and what some of the suggestions were, because it kind of reminded me, and I think it was George Mombo who said, you know, if he could do one thing for nature, he would change everything. And that leaves us all with a bit of a conundrum. And of course, there were lots of fantastic ideas coming from all over the place. But I felt some of them could be distilled down a little bit. I'm conscious as well of the things that we haven't spoken about. There's been very little talk about the ocean. And of course, the ocean is 3/4 of the planet's surface, and we're an island nation. So the ocean, I think, needs some love and attention. Maybe I'll start with Eanna, because Eanna, you were around in the 1970s on Forest Forba, and I've often think the minister said this morning. The minister said to us this morning that we were the first generation to know about these problems, and I disagree with her. I think these problems were known about many decades ago. It's just we didn't do anything about them. And you were at the forefront at the time when people were talking about nature conservation, and one of the things was about protected areas, and you were out doing surveys. I'm wondering, what role do you see protected areas today?
Well, we discovered the protected areas in the 1970s and produced areas of scientific importance in Ireland, which were the things that went on to inspire the sites for SPAs and SACs, the most important. And they were places where wildlife was really good because the land use had been done extensively, not intensively. And even looking at that book that we did in the 70s and looking at the places now, there is a diminution. And it was considered very bad form to designate somebody's land as a special area of importance, because that meant they couldn't do what they liked with it. And then people up in Dublin were sneaking onto their land, looking at things, and then saying this was now a wonderful site for nature, and this was spoiling their land. So it's always been the consideration in Ireland that the environment is the enemy. It's them or us. What is it, and how do you get rid of it? And so education really is the thing.
So do protected areas like that still have a role to play?
Well, of course they do. We have 6 national parks. We've got European legislation to actually keep them there. We've habitats directives, we've SPAs, we've SACs. We have a whole load of NHAs, which are proposed NHAs, since the 1970s, and it's 2019 since I looked the other day. Why are they still proposed? Because the people who own them don't want them.
We have a situation where the hen harrier is doing better outside of its protected areas than inside them. So, I mean, I suppose maybe it's a debate for another day, but, you know...
No, so the thing about it is that Forest Forba was set up as pre the EPA, and I worked in Forest Forba, and there was seen to be a need for it. But the minute the first recession came, I'm so old to remember the 1980s recession, and Charlie said we were living beyond our means, and he closed down Forest Forba. And we had no institute of any description to mind the environment for 5 years until the EPA came back afterwards. And the Biological Records Centre, where I was the head, shoulders and arms and legs, the only person working there, was dead for 20 years until they brought back the National Biodiversity Centre in Waterford with about 40 staff, which is great to be replaced by 40 people. But unfortunately, 20 years later, where there was nothing done about this. So it's education all the time for us to realise the importance of it all, because bit by bit, education is a big word, and we were asked for one thing. So, I mean, one thing is everything. No, one thing is one thing. If we stopped using poisoning things, that would be one thing that I saw in the 70s when you had to wipe your car with insects everywhere. You couldn't go on your bike, but your eye was full of insects. You tell ask kids now, they don't even know that there are insects to go into your eye, because there aren't. They're not there. So we are killing wildlife, and we could stop doing that. And it would work. So I see the one thing you can do for biodiversity loss, and the word is biodiversity. I mean, that's not the answer to that question. They're just words.
John, I'm gonna move to you, and one thing you said in your pitch there kind of hit a nerve, I suppose, because for decades, nature people have been like children in a cot trying to look for attention, and then all of a sudden climate change comes into the room, and everyone goes, "Oh, look over there at the climate change," and now we're going, "But hang on a second, nature still needs some love and attention." So what I think is relevant to this debate is that nature can be one of the big ways of helping with climate change. And there was a study from the United States showing that nature can provide up to 30% of the Paris climate goals. Now, one of the comments on Twitter under the hashtag was to do with bringing in a carbon tax. But I'm also wondering, could we have such a thing as a carbon rebate for people who are sucking carbon in?
Yeah, I mean, there's been quite a bit of talk, as you know, of late of this idea of carbon tax and carbon rebate. And I know Leo Varadkar has embraced it, which you always need to take a moment to wonder why. And I think there is an idea that there's a quick, easy solution here. We'll take money from you in the form of a carbon tax, and we'll magically give it back to you in the form of a carbon rebate. Well, the first question is, what's the point? What's the purpose of this? Unless it is, in other words, it's been presented as something really easy. And just like a revolving door, you pop in here and it pops back out to you. No harm done. For this to work, the purpose of this tax and rebate has to be to fundamentally change our behaviour. Now, human behaviour is pretty tough to change, as we know, and individual virtue, for want of a better word, is a dreadful way, in my opinion, to go about trying to make these kind of changes in human behaviour. I'm very much of the view that we have to approach this from a top-down point of view. We've got to get it right. So, in taxing social bads and rewarding social goods, this is how we have to move. And I should say, by the way, it's something that has got remarkably little traction since it happened, and that's the Citizens' Assembly recommendations on climate change. I had the privilege of sitting in for one full weekend in Malahide Castle and watch the Citizens' Assembly in action, and it was magnificent. It was a marvellous experience. One of the first times I've ever experienced what representative democracy might look like if you could get the lobbyists out of the room. Well, they weren't out of the room, actually. They were down the back, kicking their heels, going crazy. Meanwhile, up the front, you had 99 citizens giving up of their time, like a jury of our peers, getting together to solve the big problems. They came back with 13, what I would call, if I stood up and said them, you'd say, well, that guy's a bit radical. These are 99 of our peers, only presented with information from experts and no lobbyists. And they came back with radical proposals on the steps that we need to take. And for example, just as we're touching here, they strongly favoured carbon taxes on food. But they wanted those taxes to be sheltered and rebated to farmers who were producing organic food, horticultural food, basically low climate impact food. Now, this has gone to the Joint Oireachtas Committee to die, because this perfect suggestion, which has received the full endorsement of the Citizens' Assembly, is now being strangled by the lobbyists who are working hard night and day to make sure that the Oireachtas Committee, who, by the way, are elected by us, don't get this one out the gate. And they're telling us how impossible it is. Our peers were able to get together in a room, figure this out, examine the evidence and say, not only is this possible, this is absolutely essential, or there will be no change. We've talked earlier about reducing the national herd. How do you reduce the national herd? Do you say, pretty please, we need to get rid of 1 million cattle? No, you don't. You change the incentives. And you also apply, if some sector is a high emissions sector, and we, the taxpayer, are facing, post-2020, hundreds of millions of euro a year in fines and levies from the European Union, why should we, the taxpayer, absorb this cost? How about the people benefiting from this? How about they absorb it? And if that means that your steak is going to cost more, well, so be it. Your steak has a bigger impact, and I think we can figure out ways to eat without it.
Go ahead, James.
Just related to that, we have a very simple mechanism to implement that. Under the agri-environmental schemes of the Common Agricultural Policy, they're co-funded by the member states. We could actually take the carbon tax, design an actual climate actions in agriculture, and use that directly for the co-funding of the money that's coming from Europe. And we could actually integrate it within that policy as well. And it can be administered through the system that's already set up through the Department of Agriculture. And there you'd be incentivizing farmers to adopt climate-friendly practices, carbon sequestration in the hedgerows through better management, and you could actually design in wins for both biodiversity and for climate, and solve some of the design issues around our agri-environment schemes at the same time, and have measures both for extensive and intensive farmers across the whole land base. So some of that stuff that you're proposing there, we have the existing administrative structures with a bit of imagination to do it, so it shouldn't be a big problem for the actual government if we use existing. We have quite a complex bureaucratic structure in terms of government and administration at the moment, and I think sometimes when we add on these things in terms of tax rebates and carbon credits onto it, that it actually complicates it even more. But we could use existing structures. Rather than designing a new carbon rebate in agriculture, we could actually use existing agri-environment measures.
Very good.
If I can respond briefly.
Very briefly.
Very briefly, yeah. Just to reiterate the point, the form of agriculture that is the least hard on the natural world, without the slightest doubt, is organic agriculture. The form of agriculture that generates the best price per tonne or per output, without a doubt, is organic agriculture. We have a huge European market for it. And Ireland, of the 28 countries in the European Union, this is the origin green country, has the second lowest percentage of our land in organic agriculture. Go figure.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
we've had agriculture in this country since 5000 BC. We've had
I'm
agriculture
going
in
to
this country
move
for
it
so
on
long, and we
slightly.
had lots of wildlife until recently.
Slightly. James, you've been a very passionate advocate for high nature value farming over the years, and I'm going to ask you something a little bit different, because Edward O. Wilson, who is a well-known conservationist, has called for half the world to be given over to nature. Now, there are different words for this. In Britain, it's called rewilding. In mainland Europe, they call it non-intervention. And I'm just wondering, is there room in your land use plan for non-intervention, for giving whole areas of land and sea just for nature?
100% yes. And the reason I see this is that I follow the rewilding debate quite closely, and particularly if you use one of the ones in the UK, the farm at Neep Castle, that's held up as one of the big, that's just, we just have a scale of land use from basically nothing to very intensive agriculture. And as we move down that scale, is at a certain point we start getting into high nature value farmland, where the intensity is reduced so much that it leaves room for biodiversity, production of nature, other ecosystem services. So some land is already in this space. When the rewilding debate comes into this, it overlaps at the lower end. So a lot of the pictures I see of rewilded areas are essentially when you take an arable area here and make it HNV, or pasture land, that's called rewilding. If you take the HNV areas and make them essentially forest or semi-natural woodland, okay, that's rewilding of these areas, okay. So I see this totally, depending on, I don't get caught up in what you call it. Rewilding is seen as very threatening in the agriculture sector because it's synonymous with abandonment. But in my mind, rewilding isn't synonymous with abandonment. And the big issue I have in terms of my integrated land use policy is that you match the capacity of the land to best what it's able to produce, okay. Some land is ideally suited to produce high quantities of food with low impact on the environment, and we need this to actually eat as well, okay? Some parts of the country are ideally suited to actually produce food in an extensive manner, but produce additional services as well. And particularly these areas that are prioritised in our designated areas for calcareous grasslands, limestone pavements, extensive moorland and heathland that require a certain level of grazing to actually maintain them. But then, remember that in terms of agriculture and forestry, it currently takes up 75% of the land base. There is large other parts of the country now coming out of intensive peat production. There's large areas of the country that are poorly managed wetland areas. There are large areas of the country that are unproductive coniferous plantations, failed social experiments of the 40s and 50s, okay? So in them areas of land, I would love to see a situation where we work towards ecological restoration, which is another word for rewilding in these areas. And then, as a whole, in this integrated land use policy, we have the land of Ireland set up as a green island to meet all our needs in terms of regulating climate, regulating water quality, producing high quality food, exporting high quality food to the world, supporting a vibrant rural economy, supporting the urban people, and everyone recreating and living in this country as well. Now, a lot of people will say, I have said these sort of things before, it's very idealistic and you're only a dreamer, okay? But I think every good policy starts with a vision. And you mightn't realise that for 50, 60, 100 years, but you have to know where you're going. And I'm totally realistic about this, that we would work in 7-year cycles. But we won't get there in this 7-year cycle, or the next 7-year cycle, or the next 7-year cycle. But on each cycle, we'd be improving the situation for our children, not in the warped sense of policy we're in at the moment, where every policy cycle, we're making it worse for our children and the next generation. We have to just change this around some way.
I am struck with the I'm struck with the association between what many ecologists would love to see as rewilding and having land just for nature, and abandonment, which is such a dirty word in rural Ireland. But there's a whole conversation in that. Yvonne, you were on Radio 1 earlier this week, and it was a fantastic debate. And you mentioned, and I could detect a bit of exasperation in your voice, when you said, we have a plan, just implement the bloody thing. And in fact, you were wrong. We've 3 plans. Please implement them. And I suppose this comes back to politics, which none of you really honed in on. What is it going to take for us to get politicians to implement the law?
Absolutely. So I've been involved in policy here for the last couple of years, I guess, through the Biodiversity Forum. Something that I feel quite strongly is that unless politicians get doorstopped, unless people are saying to them, and on the doorsteps, when a politician comes knocking at your door, they hear about education, they hear about the health service, these are the big ticket items that people on the street are talking to them about. People in rural areas are talking about farm incomes, they're talking about, all that kind of stuff. Very few people, they tell me, very few people come up to them and talk to them about nature, talk to them about biodiversity, talk to them about pollinators. Ask them what they can do in their own local areas. Ask them what supports they're giving to local authorities in their homes, to home areas, to support nature and biodiversity. And so engagement is a really huge part of this. The fact that this is the first national conservation conference is just incredible. And the amount of media, the amount of conversations that have been happening over the last week, even with my neighbours, who are approaching me, asking me what plants they need to plant. This level of conversation out in the general public, I feel, is so important. And unless we're actually telling politicians we care about this stuff, they're not going to care as much as they should. So there has to be votes in this. And that's really, really critical in my view. The lobby groups are really strong, and they can push around politicians where politicians don't feel that votes are in it for them. But ultimately, votes are what matter. That's what determines whether our politicians remain in a job or become unemployed. So make your vote count, and make those conversations you have with your TDs and your MEPs. MEPs are so important at the moment with the reform of CAP. Make those conversations happen. We all have to talk to them. We all have to say, what are you doing? What are you doing for nature in my patch? What are you doing for biodiversity in my patch? How can we make farming more sustainable here in this constituency?
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. It can be exasperating when we have all the laws in place, we have all the plans in place, and I can imagine trying to explain to school children today that actually it's just that the politicians won't implement them. And I think about this all the time when I hear politicians at election time saying we're the party of law and order. What they really mean is some laws, not all the laws. Anyway. We were 10 minutes late starting because we were celebrating the 40th birthday of the Irish Wildlife Trust and the 50th birthday of Birdwatch Ireland. So if you don't mind, and nobody's going to tell me not to, I'm going to go over by 10 minutes because I'd really like to get some questions from the audience. So we have a microphone here, and I think we have a microphone over there, and I have a lady here in a kind of a rose-coloured top who's going to give us the first question. And just maybe introduce yourself, and if your question is directed to anyone in particular, say so.
Hi, I'm Annabelle Smith from Trinity College, Dublin. My question is for John. You said something in your talk about media complacency, I think was the word you used. But I come from Australia, where 66% of our media is owned by Murdoch and associated companies. Yeah, and there the media is not complacent. They're complicit in science denial and in pushing through policies that support big businesses. And I was just wondering if you could comment on, is that a problem in Ireland? Are they merely complacent or are they complicit? And if so, what can be done about it?
It's a terrific question. We've seen the politicisation of science happen in what they call the Anglophone countries, in Britain to some extent, in the US to a large extent, and in Australia. And you can follow the arc of these countries through the arc of the ownership of media. And from Murdoch has had the same influence in the US through his Fox News network and so on, and the contamination of Republican politics with climate denial. And yeah, Australia, I do follow Australian politics, unfortunately, and it's dreadful. It really is. And so we're less worse here. We don't really have active climate denial in Ireland. We don't really. We've got some silly articles and stuff, but the kind of systemic Andrew Bolt style climate denial, thankfully we don't have it here. What we have instead is complacency. And in the current situation, in my book, complacency is as dangerous as denial. We might feel better about it because we're not like those nasty Murdoch people, but essentially complacency gets you to the same place as denial. And that is, it isn't a question, by the way, just for framing, it isn't about doing what we can in relation to climate change. It's about doing what has to be done. So we can be complacent or we can be in denial. But if either of those pathways mean that we're not responding, then we're going down the same route. But you're absolutely right. Australia has a worse problem than Ireland, and Britain has a worse problem than Ireland, but not as bad as Australia, which isn't as bad as America.
Thank you for that. The question over here, Dennis.
Yeah, hi, Mike Strong. I'm with National Parks and Wildlife in the Western region. And I don't have a specific question for the panel chairman. It's from the last workshop before coffee on the topic of decision makers. I'm working in the West since 1990, and Andy Blaisdell and myself were working really hard in the 90s on overgrazing in the uplands and commonage areas in particular. And it saddens me to say that we've learned nothing from all of the work that was done. Commonages didn't get much, I didn't hear the word commonage mentioned here at all yet today. And I think we're going backwards on the commonage issues in the West, in particular in the uplands, on our coastal sand dunes, macairs, and particularly what most people don't see on offshore islands. There's a lot of problems with overstocking, erosion that's going unseen. And I think we need to address it really, really quickly, because the decision makers...
Is this a question for James?
Well, no, it's more to do with the whole policy and agricultural policies that are in place now. If you look at loss, for example, I've seen in our division in the last couple of years, in our region, there's hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of fencing going on open land that was traditionally grazed openly, and the severe, where stock are confined, where they traditionally roamed, it's adding to the overgrazing. So we're going back rapidly to where we were in the late 90s with overgrazing.
Yeah, I think this probably comes into James's land management plan. Is there a question?
No, sorry, there wasn't really a specific question to this panel.
I'm anxious because we're running out of time. There's a man at the back there waving his hand.
Ewing, I'm the coordinator of the environmental pillar. My question is not to the panel, it's actually to the audience. Yvonne raised the question of political responsibility. I'm asking the audience to put up their hands if they're willing to confront their local politicians and European politicians in the elections about biodiversity. Please put up your hands if you're willing to do it, and please do it. Thank you.
note the top question, and I apologise profusely. Obviously, the people in the National Biodiversity Centre do the work of 40 people, and that's why I thought they were there. So, well done to you 7. I'm never going.
Have a question over this side of the room? Anyone over here? No? I don't see any hands up. There's a hand up here at the front.
Thank you. John Quinn from UCC. This is probably a question for Eanna about national parks. We discussed rewilding earlier on, and that's really important. But we do have a lot of wild areas that aren't actually very well protected. And in particular, I'm thinking about, we are an island nation. We've got some of the most fantastic island habitats around the country. Most of them are unmanaged. We don't know an awful lot about their biodiversity in some cases. So I'm just wondering, do you think there's scope for a new Wild Atlantic Way Island National Park?
Well, is the Wild Atlantic Way on the land good or bad for biodiversity with all them people driving around at the speed of light? I wonder. But it's back to the farming again. The islands around our coast are owned by the farmers, and as they are aware of the importance of wildlife with the education that we're giving them, they're not going to overstock them. You were saying there was a problem with overstocking. They're not going to have rats out on them. They're not going. So it's a matter of they own these islands for such a long time, and they were such nice places. So it's not so much of battering them into doing it because you make a reserve out of it. It's encouraging them to want to do it because they feel the value of it. So we're back to education again. I should have said that for me, one good thing, to tell you the truth, because that's really the bottom line. So I wouldn't be going as such to make them all reserves. I mean, Skellig is a reserve, and look at the way it's working out.
Yeah.
We've actually done a lot of work with the offshore island and Cove Island and the Heron. So it's not that they're not educated on this, they're well aware of this. They were one of the groups that applied for a European Innovation Partnership, a quite innovative one, but the scale they were applying for it was questionable by the department whether it was possible to manage that scale. They wanted to have all the 9 inhabited offshore islands working together, managing their agriculture for nature, producing a range of services. So I think in terms of energy too, a lot of the offshore island communities are an awful lot more enlightened because of their intimate connection with nature, and they have to be for their very, very survival. So I think we can use these, and it's obvious Patrick and some of the team from the Aran Islands here and there in Life Project, some of the work that has gone on there is absolutely phenomenal. And the scale of the work that can be done on islands, because of the understanding, the close-knit communities, can be an example for the rest of our coastal communities quite quickly. But we need to be able to, and particularly the government department that's has responsibility for the islands is the government department that's hosting this conference. I think they need to invest more in the islands as beacons of sustainable development and how things can be managed well in terms of, even today, or last week I noticed there was an announcement for one of the Cork Shore Islands is being held up in Europe as a pilot for an energy study in terms of becoming energy neutral or producing their own energy as well. So not to make a reserve of them, but to actually encourage them to go on with what they're doing. Encourage them to go on with what they're doing. I think in a lot of these cases we don't need to stamp another designation on these areas. We need to actually work with the legislation there. We have enough designations and have enough stamps on places. We just need to start working together to actually realise the objectives of these areas.
Yeah, very good. I totally agree with that.
So could I just add to that? There's a distinction between inhabited islands and uninhabited islands as well. So some of the uninhabited islands are especially fantastic for seabirds. We hold 25% of the world's population of storm petrels. An island has just come up for sale off Galway called High Island for 1.25 million. It's got 3,000 pairs of storm petrels. It's places like that, I think, that we should be buying and protecting. They're not just important for wildlife, they're important for their archaeological value as well. Beehives, monastic sites, they're important for literature. Richard Murphy, the poet, spent a lot of time when he was inspired by the landscape. So I think these places are beacons for conservation. They're places which have a permanent solution. You buy them, they're permanently resolved, unlike these agricultural schemes, which we don't really know how well they work, by and large, at least on the national scale. So I think we should be focusing more on protecting these really high-value offshore sites.
Okay, thank you. I need to move it on a little bit. I have, there was a question there a second ago. How do we change the mindset of the IFA? I think that's a question for Arthur C. Clarke. There was one there as well. Decision-makers should be working at least as much with environmental organizations. I'm going to take that question because I work with environmental organizations. And environmental organizations don't have the money power that the lobbyists from the farming and the energy sector did. If we did have it, we would be up there with them, as you can see in Brussels, where there are some. And the reasons why environmental organizations don't have any money, because we don't have any members. So if you're not a member of any of the environmental organizations, that affects our income stream and that affects our ability to do anything. Now, we've run out of time. We've got one last job to do, and that is, if we can ask for the poll to come up on the screen, please. So just to give you a recap, we've had 4 arguments. So James argued for an integrated land use policy. Yvonne wanted to implement the National Biodiversity Action Plan. John said we have to stop climate change first and foremost. And Eanna said we must stop using biocides. So please, I'll give you a couple of seconds there to vote.
This is so exciting.
This is like being in Ladbrokes now, isn't it, watching the horses?
It's the Kentucky Derby.
Mayo for fun, I think.
Five or a vote. 5 or a vote. I'll see you afterwards.
Very good, very good. So I think we have a
Come on, go on, it's working. It's working. Come on.
Well, I think there's no doubt about the way anyway, so there we go.
Oh, yes.
Don't let him
Come on. We're nearly. This is
very good. I think we're plateauing now. So James, your integrated land use policy is very popular, and I think that's because you said that rewilding was a possibility. So, and I think it's been fantastic to talk about all these issues. And one of the things we didn't mention that somebody mentioned during the week was that we have to be talking about these things a bit more. We have to be having more conversations around our kitchen tables, and we have to be talking about these things to politicians. And today, for me anyway, today was a great start in that journey. So I want you to give a round of applause, please, to all our distinguished guests, and thank you very much.